remember the first play we moved to New York was called True West by Sam Shepard. John Malkovich and I were in it, and we moved it in 1982. It was the first time we went to New York with a play. Nobody in New York knew who we were, really, but it got great reviews, and it was a gigantic hit. And it was the play that really launched Malkovich's career. He went off and started doing movies after that. That was a very, very popular play. And then from that point on, like 1983, we took another play there. 1984, we took another play there. They were all hits. They were all big hits. 1985, I did a play called Orphans. Wonderful play. And it was a big, big hit. Did really well. And I got offered a directing deal with Columbia Pictures at that point. I said, well, you know, I'm the artistic director of Steppenwolf. I think it's time to step out and do something else. So I took the deal and moved to California and started and directed my first movie. It wasn't for Columbia, but Columbia gave me an office. They gave me an assistant, and I had a 2-year deal there to direct movies. I found a script that happened to be with a small company called Cinecom, and it was a movie that was released called Miles from Home with ended up being with Richard Gere. And that was the first movie I directed. Shot it in 1987. It wasn't a big hit or anything, didn't do that well, but it got some people's attention. And when I was done with that, we went into another Steppenwolf production of The Grapes of Wrath. And I played Tom Joad. If you remember the movie, Henry Fonda played that part in the movie. We eventually moved it to Broadway. It won the Tony Award. It was a big, big hit. And after we closed in 1990, I was now living in Los Angeles because I moved out to Los Angeles, and I got my first real part in a movie, which was a movie called A Midnight Clear. It was a World War II movie. And so 1991, I did my first movie, and that came out. It did pretty well as a small film. But I also had acquired the rights to make Of Mice and Men into a movie. When we were working on The Grapes of Wrath, I got very close with Elaine Steinbeck, who was John Steinbeck's widow, and she controlled the rights to all his books. And I asked her, would you give me the rights to Of Mice and Men? And she gave me the rights to Of Mice and Men, and I ended up making a movie of that. And that caught Hollywood's attention because I produced it, directed it, and was in it with John Malkovich. We had actually done the play on stage in 1980, 81. And so it was natural for me to ask John if he wanted to do it. Here it is. It came out in 1992, and things started to take off from there.
When did you get the role that everybody talks about, you know, even today?
Well, I think the producers of Forrest Gump saw Of Mice and Men, and they invited me to come in and audition for Lieutenant Dan. I did, and got lucky to get the part. We started shooting in 1993, and the movie came out in 1994, 30 years ago. 30 years ago this month, actually.
And it's still one of the favorites of all times. I've watched Apollo 13. That was a great movie, too.
Thank you.
And, of course, Ransom. That was a great one. I read that you weren't too sure about Ransom because you were the villain, but you said you had fun with it?
Yeah. Our kids were young when I read that, and, you know, my career was changing. Of Mice and Men, Forrest Gump, those things, a lot of things happened right around in there. And so the career was kind of it was ascending at that point. So I started to get offered some good things. I got offered, Ron Howard did Apollo 13. You know, it was great to work with Tom again, Tom Hanks. And then Ron's next movie after Apollo 13 was going to be Ransom. My kids were little, and I don't know if you know, I mean, you've seen Ransom. He's a pretty bad guy in it, and I didn't like him when I read it. I didn't really want to play the part of a guy who kidnaps somebody's kids, because my kids were little.
Lieutenant Dan has touched the lives of millions of veterans. And did you have any idea that that would just touch them?
Well, when we were shooting, we were having a great time making the movie, for sure. So we knew it felt good, but you never quite know how it's all going to end up. And in fact, it was very difficult for some of us to actually know what was going on in the film, because it's all these separate little stories, right? Like, I never really worked with Sally Field. One scene, one little scene with Sally and Robin Wright, but the rest of the time they were off doing their shooting all their scenes. We didn't really know what they were doing, so I had no clue until I saw the movie. It was very hard to kind of picture how the movie was going to end up, because I really didn't know what everybody was doing in the film. But when we saw it the first time, everybody, I've told a story about the image that I remember sitting there in the theater, just a small little theater. They wanted to show the cast and some of the people that worked on it before it premiered. And the lights came up, and everybody, and Robin Wright was with Sean Penn at the time, and so they were sitting down here, and they stood up and turned around, and I was sitting back there, and they both looked at me. I remember locking eyes with them, and they both had big smiles on their faces, because we all knew it was really good, and it was a really good movie. And then, of course, it opened about a week later, and it was off to the races at that point. The movie did so well, and 30 years later, it's still kind of very present in people's minds.